Good morning. I hope everyone's doing well and that you've had a great week and enjoyed some pretty fall weather. We're continuing to study Isaiah, and this week the lesson comes from chapter 31. But I'd like to review just a little bit and touch on the chapters that we're skipping since last Sunday's lesson was in chapter 25. Chapter 26 was a song of praise, and chapter 27 addressed the deliverance of Israel in the future. But chapter 28 started a series of pronouncements of the judgments that Isaiah proclaimed. And, it's typical that countries in biblical times, as well as today, would form an alliance with other countries so that they could join forces for added strength against any hostile nation. But the problem with the nation of Judah was that they seemed to put their trust in almost everything available to them except for God. Now, if you remember when we studied in chapter 7, King Ahaz of Judah had discovered that Syria and Israel had joined forces, and they wanted Judah to join in as well because of the large and powerful nation that was a threat to all of them, which was Assyria. And when King Ahaz refused to join that alliance, then those two smaller nations decided that they would invade Judah. That's when God sent Isaiah to assure Ahaz that none of that was going to come to be if he and the people of Judah trusted God. He offered to give Ahaz a sign. Do you remember? Whatever Ahaz could think of, anything that his mind could conjure up, God would do and give him so that they would know without a doubt that they could trust God, that he was all that they needed. But, Ahaz said, no, I'm not going to tempt God. It's because Ahaz had already made up his mind of what he was going to do, and he was already putting his trust in something else. He had sent money to Assyria for protection against Syria and Israel. And in time, Assyria did overpower those two countries so that Syria was no longer an independent nation, and Israel's territory was greatly reduced, with mainly the tribe of Ephraim being the one that was left. Remember, Israel was the northern part, and there were 10 tribes there, but their territory had been reduced, so there was not much left of that. And as would be expected, once Assyria gained control of Syria and Israel, well, then it became a threat to Judah as well. So once again, Judah put trust in another nation for protection from Assyria. This time, the nation that they turned to was Egypt. The nations of Israel and Judah were only there in the land where they were because God had led them out of Egypt, where they had lived as slaves. So Egypt was a bit of a strange place for Judah to put their trust. And now that brings us to the scriptures for today, which are, the first ones are Isaiah 31, 1 through 3. And it says, woe to them that go down to Egypt for help. Actually, they had probably sent a group of people there representing Judah. And stay on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. Yet he also is wise and will bring evil, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers and against the help of them that work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horse is flesh and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, both he that helpeth shall fall, and he that is holpen shall fall down, and they all shall fail together. Verse 1 tells exactly why Judah trusted Egypt. Egypt had many horses and horsemen and chariots. It had a powerful army, and Judah only had a small cavalry of soldiers. So the power and the advantage that Egypt possessed was a very promising sense of security to this small nation that were fearing a threat. But nothing that Egypt could provide was enough to go against Judah's God if Judah would only trust their God. Evidently, they had forgotten or they chose not to remember how their forefathers had crossed the Red Sea on dry land and could look back and witness the destruction of Egypt's chariots and horsemen in the raging waters. But I'm sure the Pharaoh in Egypt at this time was well aware of the history of God's people being led from Egypt and what happened when they chased them to the Red Sea. But sadly, it was clear that Judah no longer believed that God was the only source of their security. And forming an alliance with Egypt, of all the countries, was even worse than when they had allied with Assyria. If you go back and remember their history, 40 years after escaping slavery in Egypt, the Jewish nation was ready to enter into the Promised Land. At that time, Moses reviewed laws and reminded the people of the covenant that God had made with them and that they had made with him. And all this was recorded in Deuteronomy. And in chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, they were given specific instruction that pertained to their current situation. And I'm going to read that. Now, this is from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. And here's what it says. This is what Moses was telling the people before they entered into the Promised Land. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king that the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. But the part that was so important was that they are not to return to Egypt. And they were not to gather many horses for themselves. So, back to Isaiah chapter 31, in verse 2, Isaiah gets a little bit sarcastic when he says, he said, actually, yet he also is wise. In other words, he was saying, well, you might not think it, but God is wise also. It might be a little bit how we respond to our children sometimes when they get older and they start thinking that they know more than we do. But in the Bible, God has given us many good promises. And when someone makes a promise, we expect and we want them to keep those promises, especially the good ones that are going to benefit us. And this has nothing to do with Isaiah or Judah, but it reminded me of a time in when I was teaching. We had a little boy that moved into the South Carolina area, and he was from, I think, New Jersey. Now, he was a little boy in stature. He was small, and he had to exert himself, and it seemed like he got into a lot of trouble. And the last time that he got in trouble just happened to be in my classroom. And the principal called down when I had planning period, and she said that the grandmother had come out there. She had to call the grandmother. He was living with her. And she had to come out there, and she wanted to go in there, and she brought her own belt, and she wanted to go and beat him in front of the class. Well, of course, the principal wouldn't allow her to do that. So she said, well, she wanted the teacher to come up there, and she wanted the teacher to see her beat him. And she took that belt, and made him hold on to a chair. And she did give him a good whipping. But what she said was, Grandma promised you if you got in any more trouble at school, that Grandma was going to come out here and get you. And when Grandma makes a promise to you, Grandma keeps her promise. Now, I know it hurt him, but it hurt me because I was the one wiping tears away when she got through with the spanking, and I hugged him, and we had a bond after that. Now, he changed his way of his behavior at the school, and he was restored into a great situation there because nobody remembered his troubles anymore, and he just learned all of a sudden to get along with everybody. Now, so Grandma kept her promise. And you probably have said sometimes, if you do that again, I'm gonna do this. And you with children, you better mean what you say. You better be able to back it up after you've said it. But anyway, Isaiah here is telling his people that God isn't going to call back his words. Now, we want God to keep his promises, but he had some words right here that we probably would have, if we were in their shoes, we would have thought, well, I hope he doesn't do that. But he said, God is not going to call back these words. These were words of condemnation on the people of Judah and Egypt too. His promises and his words are what people can believe and count on. And his words say that he will rise against the evildoers, and that would be Judah, because they were labeled evildoers because they had betrayed God and they had put their trust in Egypt. But he said he's also going to rise against those who helped with that betrayal, which was Egypt, because Egypt was giving Judah some false hope. Judah was putting their trust in mere mortals. The men of Egypt were just men. They were not gods. Their horses were flesh. The men, the chariots, the horses, all were limited, and they were all finite. And if they would have remembered the Red Sea, they would know that the horses and the chariots would come to an end. But on the other hand, God was unstoppable and eternal. And when God stretched out his hand, is what Isaiah said, those who helped and those who were helped were going to fall, and they were going to fail together. In other words, Judah and Egypt would fail. Judah because of their betrayal of God, and Egypt because they gave that false hope and they helped in that betrayal. So now we're getting to verses 4 and 5. And it says, For thus hath the Lord spoken unto me, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey, when a multitude of shepherds is called forth against him. He will not be afraid of their voice, nor obeys him for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion, which was Jerusalem, his people, and for the hill thereof. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also, he will deliver it, and passing over, he will preserve it. Isaiah had presented some pretty bad, some dooming words. And he kept reminding his audience that these words were from God and they were not his. And he did that for a good reason, because a lot of the prophets faced persecution from Judah's leaders, because the leaders didn't want to hear the true messages that the prophets delivered. It's sort of like if a preacher preaches a sermon and it steps on your toes, you want to kind of get mad at the preacher. Well, they would get mad at the messenger. And it's not likely that they were fond here of what Isaiah had just told them. But in these verses, he does give a glimmer of God's faithfulness, even though his people had become faithless. The people were facing judgment, but not because God had the power and the desire to punish his people. God's goal was to bring about repentance and restoration. When we punish our children or our grandchildren, it's because we want them to be safe and we want them to do what's right. We may punish them, but then we're going to go to any kind of lengths that we have to protect them. And in these verses, God was depicted as in two very protective imageries. The first one was like a lion. He said he's like a lion who had captured his prey, and that the prey would have been a stray sheep or a goat. And when the shepherds would realize it and they would come running and making a lot of noise and shouting, thinking that they were going to scare the lion away and retrieve the wounded animal, that lion was not frightened at all. They didn't scare him. God may punish his people, but he watches over the remnant of faithful believers, and nothing will interfere with his protection of them. No outside army can come in and clamor and with whatever kind of military power they have, they were not going to scare God away. He would be protecting his people. And then also he was like a protective mother bird. Now, I don't know the name of the bird or the kind it is, but several times while I've been mowing grass, there's a mother bird who has little eggs nestled in the grass. And you have to look very carefully to see those eggs because they kind of blend in with the grass. And you might have seen some in your yard too. There would be little tiny eggs nestled down in not tall grass either, low grass. And anyway, when the mower would get close to this bird's nest, that mother bird would run around and flap her wings, and she would do everything she could to distract me, to keep me to move away from her eggs. One summer, I actually had a little patch of grass out in the middle of the yard because that mother bird protected her eggs. Isaiah said that God is like a mother bird who puts herself between the danger and her eggs. Instead of God pulling Israel or Judah away from danger, he's going to block that danger from getting to them. He's between the danger and his people. Now, he had already proven that when the death angel passed over the doors marked with blood. You remember when they were still in Egypt and Pharaoh would not let them leave. And the very last time he said, they had to create a sacrifice, and they took the blood and they put it over the door facing. And the death angel came that night, but it passed over all of the doors that were marked with the blood that was the sacrifice. And he said he would do it again if they would only trust him. But they were going to need to do something as well. God would handle everything, but they had to take some action too. And the next verses tell just what they needed to do in order to have God's total protection. And that would be verses 6 and 7. He said, "Turn ye unto him from whom the children of Israel have deeply revolted. For in that day every man shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which your own hands have made unto you for a sin." Now, Judah didn't just stumble into this mistake that they had made. They had made a conscious decision to put their trust in Egypt instead of God. And that was a clear revolt against God. But they were not lost now, because they could fix that through turning back to God and getting rid of their idols of silver and gold. Now, these idols might have been physical idols made of silver and gold, but they may not have been. It could have been anything that they put their trust in, but by having an idol, they thought they were in a little bit of control as well. They were seeking independence and security at the same time. Now, we have to be real careful of where we find our sense of security. It might be in our bank account. I'm sure if it starts getting low, you probably get a little bit antsy, or it might be our investments, or it may be government, or it might be people in our lives that we just are sure they're going to take care of us and we're going to be protected. All of these facets of our life are important, but they're not to replace the trust in God, and they do not provide eternal security. They're like Egypt's chariots and horses. They're finite and they're destructible. And I don't want to take too much of your time, but my Saturday morning devotion was so on point with this, and I want to read part of it to you, if you don't mind. It says, "Trust me enough to let things happen without striving to predict or control them." And I'm skipping part of it, and it says, "My love never dims, yet you are often unaware of my presence. When you project yourself into the future, rehearsing what you will do or say, you are seeking to be self-sufficient, to be adequate without my help. This is a subtle sin, so common that it usually slips by unnoticed. Train your mind to seek my help continually, even when you feel confident to handle something by yourself. Don't divide your life into things that you can do by yourself and things that require my help. Instead, rely on me in every situation. Now, verses 8 and 9 explain what would happen to Judah when this turning, if they would turn to God and they would rely on God completely. And that would be verses 8 and 9. I think that's the last ones for today also. Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword, not of a mean man, shall devour him. But he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited. And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and his furnace in Jerusalem. If Judah would turn to Egypt, or they did turn to Egypt because they were afraid of Assyria. And Isaiah told them if they would turn back to God, Assyria, which was the world's most powerful nation at that time, would fall. And it would be under God's direct intervention. God did, he could, he would, he did raise up a coalition of nations that brought Assyria down. And he did that also for the Babylonians. The point was that ultimately the downfall of any wicked nation was directed by God rather than any military force. Another nation might be used by God. They may be the instrument, but the destruction was administered by God and God only. And he said at that time when this would happen, the Assyrian soldiers, who were a great army, would be treated as any other defeated soldiers at that time. In other words, they were going to be put into forced labor. And not only the soldiers, but the kings, the officers, the leaders of Assyria would lose their stronghold and their power would crumble. And when this happens, they would recognize that it was a force of God that and that had created the destruction, and also that God's remnant of believers were going to be protected and saved. The fire in Zion that is spoken of here represented the presence of God. You know, when they moved through the 40 years of wandering before they got into the promised land, a pillar of fire and smoke led the Israelites out of Egypt. And Jerusalem was the furnace of a fire because God used the temple there to dwell with his people. So with the symbol of fire, the people were reminded once again to put their trust in God, who truly has control of all things. Now, when we face a difficult situation, do we turn to God and trust him with the circumstances first, or do we try everything else and then only turn to God when all else fails? Are we more like the Israelites than we want to think we are? Meaning, do we forget God's past faithfulness when we face a new current issue? And this is one we all might want to think about. Do we think that God was in total control in the biblical world? Because we have the history. We can see that Isaiah told them what could happen, what would happen, and then we have the history to prove that what God said did happen, indeed. But do we think he was in total control in the biblical world, but not in our very modern times? We have to think about those things. Now, I want to thank you for joining today. Hope you'll have another great week. Stay safe, help keep others safe as well, and I hope you'll join again next week. Thank you.